Hey everyone, welcome to Facebook Live. Welcome to my office. Glad you're here. We're here to talk about politics in church, which is an issue that people hate talking about. I actually wrote an article about this last year, and a lot of people freaked out on me. I think just because of the title of the article, not because they actually read what was in it. I asked a lot of you for input on what you wanted to discuss on one of these Facebook Live times, and I got a lot of different responses, and we're going to get to some of those other topics in the coming weeks, hopefully. But I decided to start off with this one for a couple of reasons. Number one, just things going on in the news. And number two, it's something that we don't like to talk about in the church. And I think that's important. There was somebody on my Twitter feed who quoted someone else, I can't remember, who said, whatever we're not allowed to talk about in church probably indicates what our idols are. And there's a lot of people who just think talking about politics in church is an absolute forbidden no-no. You can't do it. And that indicates to me that politics has probably become an idol. People don't want to see their idols uncovered. So all the more reason why we should talk about it. Sort of counterintuitively, I think that the reason the church has such a problem with politics is because we actually talk too little about it in church and not enough. So we're going to get into that today. I want to unpack for you a couple of reasons why I think we have to talk about politics in the church, and then look at three different ways to do it well. Three ways that hopefully you can engage in politics without being unnecessarily divisive in church, which is already hard enough. Some of you know I am an ordained pastor, and I was on staff at my church for a number of years. I've had to deal with people in a congregation who are politically inclined, both in a good way and in an unhealthy way. Last year at my own church, I led a class before and after the election about how Christians should think about politics, which was actually a really positive experience. More importantly, though, I've been all over the country in different roles I've had, interviewing pastors and engaging in congregations, and I've seen kind of the effects, good and bad, of politics intersecting the church, or how it's done well and how it's done poorly. So I feel like I have some experience that would inform my thoughts on this topic a little bit. As we get into this, what would be really great is just for you guys to add your comments onto the discussion side of the Facebook Live thing here, or use those little emoji kind of things to tell me what you're thinking, if this is horrible, if it's great, if you agree, if you disagree. I know there's a lot of people who probably can't watch this live. That's okay. We're going to post this on my Facebook page after it's over. So if you have comments, you can always leave them there, and I'll interact with you guys after this recording is over. And if you know people that you think would benefit from this conversation, you can tag them in the comments so that we'll get them engaged even after the broadcast is over. So yeah, there you go. You're already passing those things along. That's great. Okay, let's jump into it. First of all, I think the reason why so many people react instinctively and negatively when they hear the idea of engaging in politics in the church is because they're actually misidentifying partisanship with politics. And I completely and fully agree that partisanship is a huge problem infecting the church on all sides today, and I am in no way endorsing partisanship. But politics is different. So let me first talk to you about what partisanship really looks like and why it's so problematic. It begins with polarization, or what some are calling tribalization, and that's when people become increasingly identified with a political party or a political platform. They get a sense of their identity, their value from that political identity. And increasingly, we're becoming split as a country along partisan lines. There was this really fascinating study that was done in 1960 that asked Americans if they would be upset if their child married somebody from the opposite political party. And back in 1960, only 4% of Americans said that that would actually bother them, meaning political identity was not a huge part of how they constructed their own sense of self or their family's identity. They reconducted that poll in 2010, right, 7 years ago. And in 2010, 33% of Democrats and 49% of Republicans said that they would be horrified if their child married somebody of the opposite party. So it just shows how much more divided we've become, or more accurately, how much we've internalized party identity as part of our identity. So things have changed. That's sort of the first step, is there's this polarization. And then the second step that makes it so difficult is when every single issue then gets plugged into this partisan matrix. So increasingly, Americans think that an issue is identified with a single party, and then cooperation around that issue becomes impossible. I'll give you one example. There was a recent article I read, I'm sorry I haven't cited it or remember where it was from, but it was exploring why is the conservative party in the United States so anti-climate change, whereas conservative parties in other parts of the world don't see this as a political issue or a partisan issue. And what the article identified, I thought interestingly, was you can probably lay the blame at the feet of Al Gore. In the 1990s, Al Gore became the primary apostle of global warming. He created that documentary, Inconvenient Truth. He made it a major part of his role as vice president in the 90s. And then, of course, in 2000, when he ran for president against George W. Bush, he put climate change front and center as part of his agenda. Well, because it was carried into the public realm through a partisan figure like Al Gore, people immediately claimed environmentalism and climate change as a Democratic issue, which meant anybody who identified as Republican was automatically against it. And that's why it's become politicized in our culture. If that issue had been brought forward by, I don't know, a religious leader or a cultural leader or somebody who wasn't seen as a partisan, it may not have been a big deal. But more and more and more issues are coming into that kind of framing, and therefore we disagree about more and more things. And so partisanship, I agree, is a huge problem. It prevents us from making real progress on things that affect all of us. I am not talking about being more partisan in church. I think we actually need to be much less partisan in church. What I am talking about is engaging in politics in church. And let's get a definition out front that I think will be helpful. Webster's dictionary, they have a number of definitions for politics, but here's the one I really like. They define politics as the total complex of relationships between people living in society. The total complex of relationships between people living in society. Another way of putting it is politics is simply how we cooperate in community. It's how we engage in things both local and on a national and even international scale and get things done that benefit the whole community or protect the whole community. So the question I simply have is, how should our faith in Christ affect the way we engage our neighbors in our society to accomplish things for the common good? What really got me started thinking about this more than anything else was an article that Max Lucado wrote last year for Christianity Today. It was in the midst of the turmoil of the 2016 campaign. And Lucado wrote this post. I'm sorry, it wasn't on CT. He did an interview about it on CT. He wrote the article, I think, for the Washington Post and on his own blog, in which he came out against the language and behavior and improper engagement or tone of Donald Trump's campaign. In an interview with Christianity Today, when asked why he spoke up about a political issue, here's what Max Lucado said. This is a quote. He said, "I would have absolutely no right to speak up except that Trump repeatedly brandishes the Bible and calls himself a Christian." That line just jumped out to me, and I thought, this is remarkable. Max Lucado is saying it's only because Donald Trump claimed to be a Christian and was holding up a Bible that he, Max Lucado, felt he had any right to speak about this political figure. And I was like, wow, that's strange. Do pastors really have no right to speak about anything in the political realm unless the person in the realm claims to be a Christian? I think a lot of Christian leaders feel that way. A lot of pastors feel that way, that they really can't speak or they have no right to speak about anything political because it's in a realm that religion doesn't touch. And I think that's a really massive misunderstanding of our calling as church leaders, as pastors, as shepherds, as anybody who's responsible for leading others in the way of Christ. If we believe that there are parts of creation or parts of people's lives, parts of our culture, parts of society that are off limits to Christian faith, then I don't know, I think we're kind of guilty of a form of pastoral malpractice if we do that. I think it's a tactic of the enemy to prevent the church from really making disciples by telling us that this whole realm of things called politics is off limits to Christian faith. And then if you stuff more and more and more topics under the umbrella of politics, that means there's more and more things that the church can't go near, more and more things that we're not allowed to really bring the gospel to bear upon. And isn't that a great win for anybody who doesn't want to see people grow in their faith? So I'm not picking on Max Lucado here. I think he represents an awful lot of what American pastors think, that anything political is off limits unless there's a direct and explicit Christian connection. But that's not the case. So let me get into the two reasons why I think we need to talk more about politics in the church. And they're kind of simple, but I'll elaborate on them. The first one is this: because Jesus has called us to make disciples. It's that simple. Dallas Willard, who many of you, if you followed me for a while, know that I'm very indebted to his thinking and wisdom on a lot of things, but particularly discipleship. He says that a disciple is a person who's decided the most important thing in their life is to learn how to do what Jesus said to do. Another time he said that a disciple is someone who is learning to lead their life as Jesus would lead it if he were they. Okay, all that to say is being a disciple means following Christ in every area of our lives. And a part of our lives as 21st century Americans, assuming you're an American engaging this conversation today, part of our lives is being a citizen. It's being part of a community, part of a society, and part of a community and society in which we have been empowered to vote, to speak, to organize, to rally, to institute laws, to be part of government or to not be part of government. That's part of our role and calling as 21st century Americans. And yet so much of the church is being silent about how being a Christian affects that aspect of our lives. And again, I think that amounts to pastoral malpractice if we're not going to engage there. Now, somebody, I don't know, on Facebook or Twitter when this topic came up earlier, said to me, hey, Jesus didn't say anything about Christians engaging in government or Christians protesting or Christians trying to overthrow Caesar or anything. He just never brought it up. That's kind of an argument from silence. To be honest, there are almost an infinite number of things that Jesus does not talk about in the Gospels, but that doesn't mean that we can't or that we shouldn't. You know, Jesus doesn't say anything about savings accounts or stock markets, and yet there's a whole industry that's grown now, at least in evangelical Christianity, trying to take biblical wisdom and apply it to people's finances. So we've said it's okay to make a connection there, and we could go on and on with things that Jesus didn't talk about, but I don't think that's a reason for us to ignore this area of discipleship. Let me give you an example from Scripture, not quite from Jesus, but from somebody very close to him, and that's John the Baptist. In Luke chapter 3, before Jesus begins his public ministry, we're given a glimpse into what John's public ministry looked like. And he had an interesting couple of interactions with tax collectors and soldiers. Luke chapter 3, verse 12, he says this, tax collectors came to be baptized, and John said to them, tax collectors who came to be baptized said to John, "Teacher, what shall we do?" And he said to them, "Collect no more than you are authorized to do." Verse 14, soldiers also asked John, "And we, what shall we do?" And he said to them, "Do not extort money from anyone by threats or by false accusation, and be content with your wages." Okay, now the reason I think this is kind of interesting is John spoke about political issues here, gathering taxes, military power and authority when it came to extortion and money. These are political issues in the first century Roman world. John talks about political and economic faithfulness to soldiers and tax collectors because they had political and economic authority. And he was bringing the values of God and his kingdom to bear on these people who engaged in political and economic parts of society. I think the reason why John doesn't bring those issues up with just ordinary people, the reason why Jesus doesn't bring it up with most of the people he engages, is because honestly, most people in first century Rome didn't have political or economic authority. They didn't have any power to influence the political realities of Rome or the economic realities of Rome. So what's the point of telling them these things when they don't have it? Our reality is very different. In the modern world, in our context, we do have political authority. We do have economic authority. We do have influence over government as being part of a democratic republic. And so we got to think through, as leaders in the church, how do the realities of the kingdom of God and the message of the gospel influence the way people engage in their citizenship, in their political reality? That just needs to be a part of our discipleship. You might be familiar with Abraham Kuyper, Dutch reformer. He has this wonderful quote that's used a lot, but it's worth hearing again because it's so good. Kuyper said, "There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, 'Mine.'" Meaning there isn't an inch of creation over which Jesus is not Lord and sovereign. And so there can't be areas of life that we simply hive off and say, well, that's not a relevant place for discipleship, therefore the church shouldn't talk about it. I mean, could you imagine if churches said, hey, sexuality is off limits. We're never going to talk about that. That's not relevant to Christian faith. So good luck to you. That's something you're going to have to deal with on your own. That'd be kind of insane. We'd basically be abandoning people to whatever the culture is telling them about sexuality. And obviously we don't do that. But when it comes to political engagement, social engagement, communal action, when churches are silent, what we are doing is abandoning that area of discipleship to other voices. And very often, I think they're unhealthy voices that come through the media, talk radio, the blogosphere, social media, you name it. So it's an area of faithfulness. That's the first reason, because Jesus has called us to make disciples. Here's the second reason I think we have to talk more about politics, because Jesus has called us to love our neighbors. The greatest commandment, love God with all your heart. And the second, love your neighbor as yourself. I think at least in American evangelicalism, they've done a pretty good job of emphasizing the importance of tackling personal evil, personal sin, personal compassion, personal righteousness. But we often drop the ball when it comes to issues of systemic evil or systemic injustice or exhibiting systemic compassion toward people in our culture that are being wronged or hurt. Desmond Tutu, the South African leader, said there comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river and we need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. That's what systemic evil does. It's not just how one person is harmed, but why does this harm keep happening over and over and over to people? You may recall in the Gospels when Jesus talks about loving our neighbor as ourselves, he's questioned about it. And in response, he starts sharing the story of the Good Samaritan. In that story, a traveler was beaten and robbed and left for dead on the side of the road. The Samaritan shows up and shows compassion on him. He cares for him, brings him to an inn, pays for his care, makes sure that he's restored to health. And that's held up as being a good neighbor, a loving follower of God. So here's the question. What happens if that Samaritan comes by the road again in the same spot, and the next day he sees another guy who's beaten and left for dead and robbed? And he cares for him again. And then the third day he comes by and there's another guy left there, beaten, robbed, and destitute, and he cares for him again. What if this happened day after day after day after day? Wouldn't it be the loving thing for the Samaritan to ask a question, hey, wait a minute, why does this keep happening? And what can I do to make sure it doesn't keep happening? That's the leap from just having compassion on the person presented in front of you, which is certainly a good and Christian thing to do, to taking the step to addressing systemic evil. Is there a system at work here that can be stopped or can be changed so that more and more of my neighbors are not beaten and robbed and left for dead? That is also an impulse of Christian love. And that's what Desmond Tutu is talking about. Rather than just rescuing people out of a river who are drowning, do we need to go upstream and find out who's pushing them in the first place? So loving our neighbors isn't just merely about preventing harm to an individual, but also about encouraging systems that protect people and encourage flourishing and a seeking of the common good. So keep in mind that this isn't just good toward people who deserve it, but good toward all. There's numerous passages in Scripture that describe Jesus as healing everybody who came to him with an ailment or who suffered. There's that story, I think it's in Luke 4. Oh, I could be getting that text wrong. Jesus is at Peter's house, and he heals Peter's mother-in-law, and then it says everyone from around the town came to Jesus, and he healed every single one of them. And I'm pretty sure that not everybody Jesus healed deserved it. Not everyone that Jesus healed understood what was happening or even thanked him for it, if you remember the story of the 10 lepers. But he still healed all of them. There was a sense that Jesus came and brought good to all, not because they all deserved it, but because of who he was. And likewise, because of who we are as his followers, we want to seek what is good and flourishing for all people, even those who aren't Christian, those who disagree with us, even our enemies. So there is a need to address systemic evil as a way of loving our neighbors. And traditionally, Christians have actually had an amazing history of doing this, going all the way back to the Roman Empire. The whole idea of hospitals came from Christians. A hospital is literally, the word comes from hospitality, the same root. It's a home for strangers. It's a place where people you don't know can find healing. It was Christians who saw slavery happening in England and the British Empire and in the US and decided, you know what, it's not enough for us not to just own slaves ourselves. We need to tackle the systemic evil of slavery and pursue abolition. It was Christians who sought the systemic transformation of the prison system and recognizing how unjust it was and inhumane to people. It was Christians who saw the treatment of children in labor, especially at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and said, no, this isn't right. They didn't just help individual children, which was a good and right thing to do, they also sought to change the system that put children in factories. And we could go on down the list of issues. So 2 big reasons we need to talk more about politics: because we care about making disciples and we're called to love our neighbor. Okay, let's move on to 3 ways that this can be done that I think may avoid some of the pitfalls that some pastors or church leaders feel when you bring up the issue of talking or addressing politics in church. First one is a pastoral response. This is a way of acting very locally. It's looking at the people in your congregation, and this applies whether you're a pastor or not. If you have people in your congregation or in your Christian community who are facing challenges or struggles that really only have a social or political solution, then it behooves us as compassionate leaders to seek out those solutions. Tip O'Neill, who was a Speaker of the House back in the 1980s, said famously that all politics is local. And I think that really applies here as well. Rather than thinking about your church engaging on these huge national, international issues, although that may be appropriate, find out what's going on right in your immediate community. What's going on in your town, in your school district, in your neighborhoods that require a collective response, not just from the church, but even from neighbors outside the church, from a school district, from an education board, from a mayor or town, a police force, something that's going on that you believe needs to be addressed locally. I'll give you an example. We just, in our last Phil Vischer podcast, which came out yesterday, I think it's podcast 272, we interviewed Liz Dong, who is an undocumented immigrant. Young woman who's working for World Relief, doing great stuff, but she's one of those dreamers, one of those folks who, through a clerical error of all things, lost her status as a documented immigrant in the U.S., and now she's undocumented. And she shared the story about her youth pastor. When she was a high school student and all this happened and she lost her status, her youth pastor realized that she was at risk of being deported, separated from her family, because the system was broken. It just wasn't designed to care for someone like her. And so her youth pastor informed himself, he studied up on the issue, and he began to advocate for her, not because he was trying to get involved in some big political issue or because he wanted to change the system or fight against the man or anything kind of grandiose like that. He did it because he was simply caring for a person in his congregation, caring for her in the situation she was facing. And immigration is a great example because that's an issue that a church by itself cannot solve. It must have a political, policy, legal solution that involves government. And so he found himself engaging in politics because he cared for his flock, because he cared for one sheep in his flock that was facing an issue. So a great way to begin is to just look at what's going on in your immediate community, what's going on with people and households and families in your church that frankly requires a government solution that the church alone with its resources can't fully address. Let me give you a negative example of how I've seen this. And I've shared this on the podcast before, but there was a season where I was traveling to Arizona pretty regularly for some work projects and engaging with church leaders in that state. And this is, again, when the immigration issue was a hugely hotly debated problem, and Arizona was kind of at the epicenter of that. I interviewed a number of pastors about it, and many of them said the same thing to me. Number one, the immigration system is broken. Number two, it's terribly affecting people in their churches, families, schools, kids. It's preventing them from flourishing in their setting. Number three, most of these pastors were able to articulate a biblical reason for reforming the immigration system, compassion for the traveler, for the sojourner, for the alien among us, that kind of thing. But when I asked most of them, okay, what are you doing in your church about this? Or what are you preaching about it? Or what are you saying about it? Or how are you organizing it? Many of these church leaders said, I can't go anywhere near it. And I asked them, why not? And they said, because a lot of the people in their congregations had their minds made up about this issue because of the voices they had listened to on cable news or talk radio or whatever. And it was too toxic and it was going to cause too many problems. And my heart broke because here were church leaders saying, hey, it's affecting my flock, it's affecting my community. There's a biblical reason to engage this, but they wouldn't because it had become too toxic. There again is an example of what happens when we don't talk enough about politics in the church. We surrender the issue over to voices that may not be coming from a Christian or compassionate point of view. So first is engage pastorally. Find out what's going on in your own context. Here's the second way we can engage this, kind of a step further or deeper. and that's the peacemaker response. Politics is an immensely divisive issue, and increasingly, as I mentioned at the beginning. But there is a way to engage this as a church that brings people together as a kind of a peacemaking forum. So think about it this way. What would happen if your church became the place where people in your community, either immediately in your congregation or in the surrounding community, what if your church was the place where they came together and you modeled civil conversation, even civil debate about really challenging issues facing your community, and bring together from different points of view perspectives and honor them and respect them and begin to model a way of engaging once again as loving, faithful citizens with people you agree with, people you disagree with. If there's an issue facing your community, wouldn't it be great if both Christians and non-Christians viewed that church on the corner as the place that's going to convene us and help us think about this wisely? In my own community here this past year, forget the election, the presidential election, probably the most contentious thing was a referendum about raising funds for the school board. And taxes in Illinois, where I live, are already astronomical. And there were neighbors who were fighting about this and putting up yard signs one way or the other. And I remember thinking, this is an issue that's affecting families, households, schools right here in our immediate community. And there's a lot of division. Why doesn't the church speak into this? Not with necessarily a point of view like vote yes or no, but bringing people together from across the spectrum to say, hey, let's model being good civil neighbors, and let's talk about this in a good way, in a helpful way. And having church leaders or church facilities used to do that, I think would have been a great way of modeling Christian values for our community. I think there's a couple of examples that you may be aware of this recently, at least relatively recently. Back in 2008, Rick Warren tried to do this at Saddleback, when I forget what they called it, but he had Barack Obama and John McCain at the church. And I think Rick did a pretty good job of modeling a wise, thoughtful, engaged Christian perspective on the presidential election that year. And I was proud of him for doing that and modeling that for the country. Brian McLaren, I know he can be a divisive figure depending on what you think of his theology, but I remember having a conversation with him many years ago when he was still a pastor of a church not too far from Washington, D.C., and he brought up something they did at his church that I thought was brilliant. He said every election year, because there were people in his church from across the political spectrum, many of whom worked in various agencies in Washington, they would have a forum where they would bring a panel together of people from different political persuasions who were all committed to Christ, who were part of the church, to talk about the election and issues of the election from a Christian point of view. And the church leaders would select people that they felt were mature in their faith, wise in their thinking, who would act respectfully and civilly, and model for the church how do Christians engage in politics, even in areas where they disagree, in a way that brings honor to Christ and civility to the conversation. Great idea. Another way of being a peacemaker as the church, as the church's role in a very contentious political environment. So that's the second way. The pastoral response, the peacemaker response. Here's the third one, which gets a little more uncomfortable, and that's the prophetic response. Once I'm done with this, I'll open it up to some of your questions. So the prophetic response basically says, sometimes prophets are called by God to put a spotlight on injustice that exists in the shadows. Things, you can go back to the Old Testament and see this, things that ancient Israel was doing that was offensive to God, that they saw no problem with, or that they kept at the periphery, and the prophet would come along and say, thus saith the Lord, this doesn't stand, this is bad news, and brings it into the light. Sometimes we are called as churches to organize and to draw attention, even protest, things that are evil and broken and wrong in society. John the Baptist, another reflection on him, this is what he did. He brought attention to the unjust evil of Herod, and people hated him for it. Herod certainly did, and he lost his head as a result. So prophets are most often unpopular because they're pointing out things that the culture doesn't want pointed out. They're unmasking idols that the culture wants to keep worshiping. They're pointing out hypocrisies even in the church that the church would rather not deal with. So this is a difficult area because I think a lot of the American church has lost its prophetic calling. It's lost its desire or stomach for being hated or disliked. We just want everyone to get along, and therefore we avoid anything that rocks the boat. But sometimes there is evil and injustice that needs to be highlighted, that needs attention. again, on my Facebook page, some of you may have interacted with me about the NFL protest, and many of you have said this is too divisive, the kneeling for the flag and the anthem, and it's not bringing people together, it's causing division. And frankly, I agree with you. It is causing division. It is uncomfortable. It does cause disunity for people. But honestly, that's exactly the point of protest. If everyone was unified, it wouldn't be anything worth protesting. If everyone was happy about it, if it was popular, it wouldn't be a protest anymore. The Washington Post published some interesting figures that I thought would be helpful here. Back in the 1960s, only 22% of Americans agreed with the freedom rides, those Northerners who were riding to the South to draw attention to injustice and segregation. Only 22% of Americans agreed with that. Only 28% of Americans agreed with sit-ins, right? Where African Americans would go into a segregated establishment, a Woolworth's lunch counter, something like that, and sit in. Most Americans thought, well, that's wrong. You shouldn't do that. It's too divisive. Here's a crazy one. In 1966, 60% of Americans had an unfavorable view of Martin Luther King Jr. That's 2/3 of Americans had a negative view of Martin Luther King Jr. And now there's a monument to him in Washington, D.C. The point is, protests and profits are always unpopular at the time. It's only in retrospect that people come to recognize the righteousness of the action that was being taken and come to understand it and agree with it. So there are times where the church is called to be prophetic and unpopular and disliked in calling out the injustice and evils of the world. And I think the reason why a lot of evangelicals in particular have problems with that is so much of our instinct is we must be liked in our culture if we're going to win people to Christ. And if we protest, they're not going to like us. And then therefore, how will the gospel go forward? And that's a whole nother can of worms, because I think it's partly a misdefinition of what the gospel is, but we can get into that in a future Facebook Live time, perhaps. So, all right, I'm looking at your comments now. So let me see what some of you are saying here. What current political issues do you think the church needs to address? Michael, that's a good question. There are a lot, but I would put the priority on those issues that are affecting people who can't speak out for themselves or don't have any political voice of their own. So traditionally, at least the conservative church has spoken out for the unborn, which I'm all for. I think we also need to bring that kind of intervention for immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, for our neighbors of color who may not have a voice or political authority in areas where they need it. So I'm looking for those who are most harmed or marginalized by the system or don't have a voice. Okay, Cindy says, do more of these. I hope to, I plan to, with your feedback. How do you get a congregation to a place where people are even open to discussing political issues in a church context, or pastors to feel that they need to talk about them? Wow. Bethany, great question. I'll speak to this personally. I think for a church leader, the only way they're ever going to really find the courage to address some of these issues is when a church leader recognizes that ultimately they are not accountable to the people in their church. They're accountable to Jesus himself. I remember many years ago sitting at a church service with my dad, who's not a Christian. And after the sermon, he turned to me and he said, how can I trust anything that pastor just said is true? And I said to him, well, I've studied scripture. I was in seminary at the time, I think. And I said, I can tell you that what the pastor said is good. It was solid. And he said, no, you're not understanding. My dad went on to say, everyone in this church pays that guy's salary, right? And I said, yeah. And he said, anybody in this church could turn around and fire this pastor anytime they wanted. And I said, well, yeah, probably. It was that kind of polity in that church. And my dad said, so why would I trust anything this pastor says when there's no incentive for him to say anything other than what the people here want to hear? And I was like, oh, okay, time out. Like, I wasn't ready to get that kind of question from my dad, but it's a great question. And the only honest response I could give is the only way to trust a pastor is if the pastor fears God more than they fear their congregation. So a pastor needs to get to that place of not worrying as much about how are my people going to respond to this issue if I bring it up, as much as how can I honestly stand before the Lord and explain why I didn't address this issue that was affecting people in my congregation or whatever it might be. So that, I think, it's a deep soul searching issue for a lot of church leaders. And I don't want to make it sound like it's so simple. It's not. It's a very difficult thing, but I think that's a significant part of it. And also it's remembering as a church leader, there is a difference between shepherding the church and managing the 501c3 organization that we call churches. The 501c3 is measured by how many people are showing up, how much money are they putting in a plate, and all those institutional measurements. How people are actually living and walking and communing with Christ faithfully in their lives, that's a whole different set of measurements. And I think that's what we're ultimately going to be held accountable for, not how stable and financially secure was your institution. All these are issues. Actually, over my shoulder is my new book, Immeasurable: Reflections on the Soul of Ministry in the Age of Church, Inc., that address some of this stuff. It doesn't really get into political issues, but what does it mean to engage in faithful ministry? Okay, we're rapidly running out of time here, so I'll try to take one more. Dave, is it realistic to think a prophet could be a paid staff member at an evangelical church, or should that type of prophetic work be done from the pews? Good question. You know, I think it's a good point. And it depends on the polities. There are some church structures that protect the prophetic voice more. In other words, they tend not to be congregational-led churches that can just revolt and kick a pastor out. So I think it is possible to have a prophetic voice in the church, even in an evangelical environment. It's more challenging for some reasons. It is still possible. And I'm not in favor of a John the Baptist approach where like pastors just say the craziest, harshest thing, at any time. We need to be wise and thoughtful in how we move people along. But I think there's a lot of steps that we can take. I'll tell you, the pastor at my church, I think, has done a very good job of incorporating current events into his sermons and into what's going on in a way that sometimes makes people uncomfortable. And I think it's his way of just churning up the temperature a little bit and getting the church more and more acclimated to even mentioning current events and politically tense things that are going on in the sermons without even getting into, taking sides or anything like that. The fact that I was invited to do a class last year at my church on politics and the election shows that our church is gaining a tolerance and stretching its muscles in this whole topic. And there is wise leadership that turns that temperature up slowly and gets people acclimated to thinking about this. I wouldn't necessarily recommend just this Sunday suddenly, blowing the place up by going political on everyone. And like I said, start with local stuff. A lot of people, if you immediately jump into the pulpit and start talking about Donald Trump or the Democrats or healthcare or something, really divisive, people will flip out. But if you start talking about something that's going on in your town, an issue that's going on in your school district, something that affects families in your immediate area, I think it gives you a lot more license as a pastor to speak on those issues. One that a lot of our communities are facing is this immigration issue. And yes, it is a national thing and it's been a platform in the elections, but there are so many people being immediately affected by it in our schools and our communities and our churches. I think that that's a natural connection point for pastors to say, hey, look, we care about this family, we care about these kids, we want to help them out, and we're going to do things as a church, but immigration is something that can only be solved with political engagement. And so we have to talk about this, not because I want to or because I want to get divisive, but because I care, because we love these people. I think that goes a long way to beginning to engage a prophetic voice without being the angry prophet that so many people think about. Okay, guys, I'm about out of time. My kids are about to come home from school. This is my home office. I work from home. And when my kids are home, I work a lot less from home. So thank you for engaging. I'm going to post this up on my Facebook page so we can keep talking in the comment section. Like I said, tag your friends who you think would benefit from this conversation so they can see the video and perhaps join the conversation. We'll do another one of these, hoping next week, different topic, probably a completely different topic. And then I'm going overseas for a little bit and then I'll see what I can do there. One last thing, if this is a subject that you want to dive a little deeper into, I'd really recommend picking up my ebook, which is called The Voting Booth. It's available at Amazon on Kindle. I think it's just a couple of bucks. It's about 65 pages. It's a dialogue. It's written as a dialogue between four characters about what does faithful Christian engagement in the public square really look like. And it's a simple, engaging, hopefully kind of read. So go look at that, check that out. It's probably the best resource I have on this topic. And I'll continue to engage with you guys online in your comments. Thanks for being here. I appreciate your participation. And until next time, have a great one.